John enters heaven. And there in heaven stands a throne. Probably here, there are a variety of things that could be resonating here with John's experience. Two that seem to be the most likely are Isaiah's experience in Isaiah chapter 6 and Ezekiel's experience in chapter 1. Somebody turn and read Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, please.
In the year that King Messiah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke.
And so, I mean, there's certainly some differences here between Isaiah's experience and John's experience. And Isaiah's in the temple. Isaiah mostly experiences God and the seraphim. But this idea about being in the presence of God, being before God's throne, the experience here is so overwhelming for John because there's just so much that's going on. The word throne or thrones appears 40 times in the book of Revelation. Almost 40 times, it's actually a little less. 17 of those occur in chapters 4 and 5. And so the word throne shows up so many times in these 2 chapters. The throne in heaven, right? And we already kind of talked about this, right? God is in control. He's ruling over earth. He's ruling over everything. But in thinking about John suddenly being there in heaven, where do you think that throne is? As far as like what he sees, where is the throne? Well, it's in the throne room, right? But as far as like position-wise, spatially, it's in the center of everything, right? It's the focal point, right? Because John starts off with, his attention is kind of drawn to the throne. With all the other stuff that's going on in these chapters, it's drawn to the throne. Everything is around it. Everything's before it. With all of the things that are mentioned and described here, several people have noted that the floor plan of heaven, as John describes it, sounds very similar to what we might conceive of as the tabernacle or the temple. A couple of things, right? John talks about the sea of glass, right? So there's the presence of water, like there would have been in the tabernacle or the temple. We know from later passages, the Ark of the Covenant appears in chapter 11, verse 19. Incense is offered on an altar in chapter 8, verse 3. Right? There's another altar, probably very similar to the altar of burnt offering, that is talked about in chapter 6, verse 9. And then, of course, there is the most holy place, the place where God is. And so maybe it's meant to recall to people the layout of the temple, the layout of the tabernacle. But John's not just interested in the throne. He's interested in the one who sits on the throne. Now, of course, we immediately know, even if we haven't read the rest of Revelation, the one seated on the throne is God. But one of the things that keeps being repeated here is the one on the throne, the one on the throne. It's not God, God, God. It's the one on the throne, the one on the throne, the one on the throne. Right? Again, reinforcing this idea of God is on the throne. But in opposition to Caesar being on his throne, right? Why keep mentioning throne, 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 throne? It's to remind them that, yes, Caesar sits on his throne at Rome, but who's really in control is the one who sits on his throne in heaven.
Is him saying one seated there kind of also alluding to the Trinity itself? He's the one part of the Trinity that's on the throne, and you have the Holy Spirit that's with the people, and Jesus who was with the people and sits next to God.
That may be, there might be something to that, because the Lamb will show up in chapter 5. The seven spirits, the seven torches, probably represent the Holy Spirit. So it probably has some Trinitarian connections connected with it, especially if we take the whole image, instead of just going it by piece. But in seeing the one seated there, right? That's kind of the thing that John's really focused on, the one seated there. He says he looks like. Right? So by using the word like, John has indicated to us, you may probably not cognitively thinking about this, that what is coming is a comparison, technically a simile, right? A comparison using like or as. So don't take this as, this is how God really looks. John is saying, God on his throne, as I'm experiencing it, kind of looks like this. Let's flip to Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, because there's an interesting parallel here with John's description before we get into that. So somebody go ahead and read Ezekiel 1, verses 26 through 28.
The American Standard Bible. Now above the experience that was over their head, there was something resembling a throne, like lapis lazuli in appearance, and on that which resembled a throne, high up was a figure with the appearance of a man. And I noticed from the appearance of his loins and upwards something like glowing metal that looked like fire all around within. And from the appearance of his loins and downward I saw something like fire. And there was a radiance around him. As the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard a voice speaking.
Yeah, so Ezekiel describing his experience has some similarity there. He's talking about this kind of radiance, brilliance, and that's meant. And those things are reflected in the using of several different jewels. What's interesting here is that when describing the one seated on the throne, John doesn't describe him as a figure, right? So he's not described as a human being would be. He's not described as an animal in any sense. It's the one seated on the throne looked like a variety of jewels. Looks like jasper. And jasper at the time we're talking about, at least the word seems to refer to a jewel that would have been very, very clear and would sparkle and flash as the light hit. And so that's the image of when he says jasper. And if we look at chapter 21 of Revelation, in verse 11, the jasper appears again, talking about the foundations of the New Jerusalem. John talks about the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, and he says, it has the glory of God and a radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. Right? And so perhaps by using jasper, it's meant to suggest God's glory. Right? And so I see jasper, but that's communicating God's glory. The other jewel is, some translations say carnelian, others say sardine or sardinius, which may have been where the name sardis came from, was the jewel that's described here. However, it's a deep red stone, and often people described it as appearing to hold fire within it. And so in the jasper communicating God's glory, radiance, sparkles, perhaps the carnelian, in having this fire, is meant to convey God's wrath, God's justice, God's judgment. And then finally here, The third jewel that's described is the emerald. And so there's this kind of rainbow that looks like an emerald. Maybe meant to convey calmness, soothing. One of the issues with Revelation, from a Greek standpoint, that we haven't talked about yet, we've talked about how John plays with some of the rules a little bit. In Revelation, there are a lot of words that are only used one time in the entire New Testament, and a lot of them are these kind of jewels. And so translators have had a difficulty trying to figure out exactly which jewel all the time is what's represented. And so that's why you'll see, like, I used the New Revised Standard and it said carnelian, and the one Matt was reading from said sardinus or sardinius or whatever. So that's why you'll find these differences in the jewels, is that the translators are trying to figure out, because it's only used one time in the entire New Testament. But in trying to suggest that using these jewels, even if we can't quite figure them out all the time, you know, there's something precious, there's something valuable in the brilliance as well. In fact, some people suggested that the word that's translated emerald could also refer to a rock crystal which would act like a prism. And a prism, once the light hits it, creates a rainbow. Right? And so that might be the jewel, even though a lot of translators use emerald. Right? That could be how the emerald and the rainbow connect together. But especially for those first readers of Revelation, when they heard rainbow around the throne, what might they have thought of? Right? No. In Genesis chapter 6, and the promise that God makes to not destroy the earth by water anymore. Maybe suggesting that despite the terror and the horrible things that are coming, God still remembers His promise. Right? God still remembers His covenant. It could also mean that perhaps something new is coming. And just like something new came out of the end of the flood, something new is coming out of what God is doing. But why these stones? Well, again, we can't be certain to an absolute extent, but perhaps it has to do with they reflecting the characteristics of God. Jasper suggesting that glory, majesty. Carnelian suggesting wrath or judgment. And emerald suggesting grace or mercy. The brilliance and radiance. These three stones were also part of the high priest's breastplate. And the high priest at the tabernacle of the temple had a breastplate that was worn over the garments that had 12 stones in it that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Jasper was for the tribe of Benjamin, carnelian was for the tribe of Reuben, and emerald was for the tribe of Judah. And so maybe there's a connection there somehow. But again, we're not told completely. I think it probably is meant to reflect those characteristics, right? The majesty, the wrath, the grace. Around this central throne are 24 thrones, and on those 24 thrones are 24 elders. A lot of people, in thinking about this part, have said, okay, so who are these people? And so there have been a variety of suggestions that have been made regarding the identity of the 24 elders. Some people have suggested that they are stars, that there is an influence here from Babylonian views, and so they are, personified stars. There are personified stars in Revelation. A star called Wormwood, for example. But even those stars that are personified are referred to as stars. So why call them here elders? And so it doesn't make sense if these are personified stars, but that's been one suggestion. A second suggestion has been that they are angels. But here again, why not say angels when you say angels everywhere else? And why call them elders in this one specific part? Some people have suggested that they're representative of holy people from the Old Testament. or angelic representatives of holy people from the Old Testament. And again, probably not, I don't think the angelic representatives works because you say angels everywhere else. But perhaps this is meant to evoke, the entirety of God's people from the Old Testament. Some people have suggested, well, it's meant to evoke the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. Which immediately you probably go, wait, that doesn't sound right. Because in the Old Testament, how many books are there? Somebody's going to know this, right? 39, okay, 39. All right, so 27 new, 39 old. Not the same in the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, the books were counted differently. And so the 12 minor prophets were counted as one book. Right? So even though there's 12 separate documents, they were counted as one book. Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were each one book. So there wasn't 1st and 2nd Samuel, it was just Samuel, it was Kings, it was Chronicles. And then Ezra and Nehemiah counted as one book. And so once you add all of those together, you come up with 24. And so the Jewish tradition was that there were 24 authors of the Bible, there were 24 books. And so perhaps that is where these 24 elders are representative. Another view was that the priestly orders in the temple numbered 24. Right? And so David organized the priests into 24 separate groups and assigned them responsibilities based on what group they were in. And so perhaps that is where this comes from. But additionally, we also talked about 24, of course, is 12 plus 12, or 2 times 12, so it's probably having something to do with completion. And thinking about things that are 12, perhaps it is the 12 patriarchs, right, the 12 tribes of Israel, plus the 12 apostles. Which, of course, given the way we've been approaching it, would have to be symbolic, because who's seeing this? John, who we've been saying is probably John the Apostle. So, wait a second, right? Can't be literal, because I'm here and I'm there, right? So it's representative, it's figurative in this case. A couple of things, though, that might detract from that. No other human beings are described in chapter 4. And so some people said it's probably not. People that support the idea that these are angelic beings would say no other humans are described in chapter 4. Plus, in places like Colossians, Ephesians, angelic beings are referred to as things like thrones, powers, rulers, and authorities, right, which may be reflective here. The one that seems to be most convincing to me is the representation of the 12 patriarchs and the 12 apostles, with, of course, this being very symbolic since John is the one seeing. But thinking that it stands in for the complete number of God's people, right, both Old Testament and New Testament. Whoever they are dressed in white robes. Again, that idea of the white robe suggesting purity, suggesting righteousness. And on their heads are crowns, golden crowns, suggesting maybe that these are royal priests, right? The white linen clothes that the priests would have worn for their service, plus the crowns. Of course, Peter refers to followers of God as being a royal priesthood. Similar concept is in Exodus chapter 19 for the Israelites. Despite these crowns being golden, however, they are the Stephanos, the victory crown. Right? They're not the ruling diadema crown. They are the victory crown. They are not as much rulers as they are victors.